These are the lecture notes for Chapter 1 of Human Anatomy and Physiology. Chapter 1 is on the human body and orientation. And let me set this up so we can look at it in the slideshow view. Okay, and this slide number 2 just talks about why this chapter, the information in this chapter matters. This is actually a very important chapter because it gives you the basic background for all the rest of the chapters. The anatomical terminology that will be covered in this chapter you will use for the entire rest of the semester, as well as you will use it for Bio 169. So it's a very good background information chapter. We will also cover a little bit of information on just basic chemistry and basic biology, cell biology, because your chapter number 2 is on chemistry and chapter number 3 is on cells. And the reason for that is because the rest of the chapters in anatomy and physiology build on those. That's number 1. And then number 2, many of you will be taking an exam or a test like the TEAS test, and a lot of that information comes up. So we always teach the chemistry and the cell chapter, but this first chapter is going to be, if you've had medical office terminology or a course such as that, this chapter will be a lot of review for you. But if you haven't, you'll really, this would be some really good information for you. Now there's a video, and this is slide number 3. If you would like to watch this video, you'll just have to go back and click on the slides in the Moodle module number 1, week number 1, and you can watch it. So let's start with section 1.1, and it's just really helping you to understand the relationship between anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is focusing on body structure and physiology is focusing on body function. And the relationship between the two is that the structure of a body part determines its function. Its function is determined by its structure. So they're interrelated. It's very difficult to study just anatomy without really having any understanding of how the structures work. When we learn the bones, when we learn the muscles, when we learn the nerves, the blood vessels, I'm sorry, you will not learn until Bio 169. But when we learn those structures, just the names and locations of those structures, then we're just doing anatomy. But when we learn, for example, how two bones fit together to form a joint and how that joint is able to move in different ways, the range of motion of that joint, then we're using the structure to understand the function or the physiology. And so going back to just anatomy, there are some subdivisions of anatomy. And the first one we just call macroscopic anatomy. Macroscopic meaning we're not going to have to use a microscope to study these structures. These are visible, large structures, like the muscles, for example. Gross is another word, gross or macroscopic anatomy. And sometimes we'll study anatomy as regional anatomy. So we just look at a particular area of the body, like the head, and we look at all the structures in the head. Systemic anatomy or system anatomy, we're just studying one body system. There are 11 body systems. We're going to introduce them in this chapter. But like if we just study cardiovascular anatomy, we're just going to learn about the structures of the heart, their names and their locations. Surface anatomy looks at internal structures as they relate to overlying skin. this morning I had blood drawn, and so the phlebotomist has to understand some surface anatomy because she has to get to my median cubital vein on the inside of my arm by, palpating the surface of my, the bend in my elbow. Okay, which you will learn the name for that is I'm sorry, I got interrupted. So it's the antecubital region is the region where your elbow bends, and that's where they generally take blood when they're doing blood work on you. Excuse me. So microscopic anatomy, we're going to use that when we study cytology or cells in chapter 3 and histology or tissues in chapter 4. And then there's developmental anatomy, and one example of that is embryology, and that's when we study the different stages of the embryo and fetus. Well, it's embryology, so it would just be the embryo before birth. And then there's some terms here I want to make sure you know. So to study anatomy, one must know anatomical terminology and be able to observe, manipulate, palpate, which means to touch, and that's what the phlebotomist again was doing whenever she was palpating to find my vein. And then auscultate is going to be listening, like listening to heart sounds. There we go. All right, and so some subdivisions of physiology can be based on organ systems. So we could say renal physiology, which is the study of kidney function. And then oftentimes physiology focuses on the cellular and molecular levels of the body. So we're actually even going into different chemical reactions that occur. I guess, for example, when we think about muscle contraction and nerve impulses, those reactions happen within muscle cells and nerve cells, and they are chemical and electrical in function. So you have to understand. You have to learn about the molecules that are at work, the ions that are at work, and how they bring about a muscle contraction. So that would be physiology. The principle of complementarity of structure and function is just basically saying that anatomy and physiology complement each other. You can't really learn one without the other very well anyway. Function always reflects structure, and what a structure can do, its function depends on its specific form. So that's the principle of complementarity. Here is an example. The structure of your incisors or your front teeth helps them to be able to function in cutting. And the structure of your molars, your back teeth, helps them to be able to function in grinding. So it's a pretty basic thing, but it's a very important concept that kind of comes back to us over and over and over in this course. All right, 1.2 is structural organization, and I'll just tell you here, this is a review of biology, and you will have to know the levels of organization from the smallest or simplest level, which is the atom, to the entire organism. In biology, we then go as high as we take organism, and then species and populations and communities and ecosystems and biosphere. We go further than the organism, but in human anatomy, we will stop at organism. And what I'm actually going to do is make you, well, let me go over this, sorry. Let me go over this first with you, the illustrations. So the simplest level of structural organization are atoms. And I can tell by looking at this, because I know what these molecules are, that the blue atoms represented here are oxygen And the red ones are, I'm so sorry, they're hydrogen, and the red ones are oxygen, and the gray ones are carbon. So atoms, as you can see, combine to form molecules. Molecules will be the next highest level of organization. And these molecules are, this is one carbon in the center with 2 oxygen atoms on each side. That is carbon dioxide. And then there is an oxygen in the second molecule, an oxygen in the center with 2 hydrogen atoms kind of bent at an angle, but they're on each side of the oxygen, and that would be water, H2O. So it would start with atoms and then molecules, and then the molecules combine, small molecules can combine to form much larger molecules, and like proteins. And those large molecules will form the little parts inside the cell called organelles. What you're looking at is a mitochondria, which is the place in the cell that produces ATP or energy. Then you're looking at the next level, which is the cellular level, and this example is a smooth muscle cell. There are actually 3 types of muscle cells. There's smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. This one is a smooth muscle cell. And then groups of cells form tissues. This example is smooth muscle tissue, like you would find in, for example, in the walls of your blood vessels or the walls of your digestive tract. And then you can see here a blood vessel, which is the organ level. So tissues combine to form organs. You can see that there is smooth muscle in the walls of this blood vessel. There's connective tissue on the outer wall, or the outer side of the smooth muscle. And there is epithelial tissue lining the inner portion of that blood vessel. So there's 3 different tissues that are combining to form this organ. And then organs combine to form organ systems. This organ system would be the cardiovascular system because it's a combination of blood vessels and the heart. And organ systems, there are 11 in the human body, combined to form the entire organism. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make you a slide that shows you the order. Let's see, insert new slide. And insert text box. This will take just a minute, but I think you'll be able to use it. Atoms, so this is from simplest to most complex. And atoms, molecules, organelles, cells, tissues. Oops. Tissues combine to form organs. Organs combine to form organ systems, sometimes called body systems. And then all of the organ systems together combine to make the organism. So that's just to help you. This is from simplest to most complex, and you can also be asked to know them backwards from most complex down to simplest. But it's normally all the questions I've seen and remember, they just ask you the order from simplest to most complex. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow now and go to the section 1.3, which is the requirements for life. Maintenance of life involves maintaining boundaries, movement, responsiveness, digestion, metabolism, excretion, reproduction, and growth. So maintaining boundaries is referring to separating internal and external environments. And there are 2 really good examples of maintaining boundaries. The plasma membrane is the boundary that separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And it's the covering of every one of your cells. It's called a plasma membrane. And then the skin is a boundary that separates our insides from the environment outside of us. So maintaining boundaries is necessary. Movement is necessary. And a lot of times when we think of movement, we think of walking and talking and, using our hands, do things like type, write, cook,